Okay, one more lecture for Unit 2. On this one, I want to talk about colonial economics. Something that you may be familiar with from world history or AP Euro is this concept of a global economy. When European powers began to colonize the New World, one thing that emerged over time, kind of very organically, are these transatlantic trade routes, and they kind of took the shape of a triangle. So sometimes we call this the triangle trade, the triangular trade. What you'll see here is lots of different exchange of goods and commodities. Natural resources, or just things like um, rice or lumber or fur going from the new world back to the old world. You'll see some trade from the old world and Africa, things like guns and iron and beer being traded in, gold and spices going back. And of course, the saddest part of this triangular trade pattern is the movement of uh, African slaves across the Atlantic in what was known as the Middle Passage. And these aren't the only things that go on these trade routes, but you can see and read through it. But this kind of globalization definitely changes the economic structures for many countries. The systems that developed were known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic theory or a way a country might go about setting up their economy. On this slide, I gave you the official definition. I won't read that to you. But in practice, the idea here is that you have a mother country and then you have child colonies. And the goal for the mother country is to obtain a favorable balance of trade, a good system where your exports are exceeding your imports. And a mother country could do this by relying on colonies to provide cheap resources, and then take those cheap resources in the mother country, manufacture them, produce them, turn them into finished goods and commodities, and then your colonies are then a very large market for you to sell your finished goods right back to. This kind of reciprocal relationship of the colonies providing resources, but then also providing a market for the mother country, made it very easy for a country to increase its wealth through taxes and other customs duties and things like that, and to accrue power. And that's really the goal of mercantilism: is you set up a favorable balance of trade, but in doing so, you come to dominate the seas, you come to dominate different areas around the globe, and you've got a favorable balance of trade and power. So how do you do this? Well, throughout the 1600s and 1700s, Great Britain passed laws to enforce their mercantilist policies, and these laws are called Navigation Acts. On this screen, and again, I won't read both of these to you, but you see a couple of them. I would point out, notice the two different times. 1660 and 1696. There's not just one set of navigation acts. These were kind of continually and repeatedly coming out throughout the colonial period, where Great Britain would try to enforce favorable economic policies. I think in this one, it's basically saying colonial goods shall be transported from any of the said English plantations. This is forbidding the transport of colonial goods to any other country other than those belonging to His Majesty. So basically saying, yeah, you can't trade with France, you can't trade with Spain, you can't trade with the Dutch. This one over here is talking about ships. It's saying that you have to use British mariners and British ships, and if you try to ship your goods on another nation's ships, you could forfeit or lose your goods. So these are strict navigation policies meant to financially benefit the mother country. So then you ask, well, how do the colonists feel about this? Well, not terribly. In a minute, I'll show you. The colonists more or less ignore those policies, so they don't like them, but Britain actually undertook a policy of neglect. Now, This is not a formal policy. Nowhere are you going to see, British ministers saying, here's our navigation law, but don't enforce it. This definition of what's called sanitary neglect says the possibly non-deliberate. I actually think that there was a mix of intentionality and non-intentionality to this, but the British Crown um, throughout the 1600s and 1700s took a policy of avoiding strict enforcement, especially trade laws meant to keep the colonies obedient. In other words, they looked the other way for the sake of harmony. Now, you might think that's weird. Why pass a law if you're not really going to enforce it? Well, first of all, I think we all know that some laws accomplish their goals in part just by being a law. Even if it's not enforced, most people are going to obey that law or at least heed the recommendation or the advice. Um, so, um, why pass the law if you're not going to enforce it? Well, just pass the law might accomplish some good. Secondly, there's this idea of looking the other way for the sake of harmony. Sometimes, if you tried to enforce every law, it would just bog down the system. I do this with my kids often, where we have rules in our house. But if my kids are down in the basement and I hear them kind of break a rule, am I always going to run down there, stop everything that I'm doing to try to enforce it? Or is it kind of out of sight, out of mind? Great Britain has a lot going on in the 1600s and 1700s in terms of mainland Europe and other world affairs. Maybe they don't feel, for the sake of progress, that it's in their best interest to enforce every single navigation act. Here's a colonial viewpoint, kind of. What this is this is a guy named Edward Randolph. He's a customs officer. So he's supposed to be in the colonies enforcing the taxes and the navigation acts. But he's writing a letter back to the king essentially saying, they are openly disobeying you. He's like, I'm in the harbor and I see ships from other countries, and they tell me that you actually have no right to enact navigation laws, only laws made by their local assemblies, by their representative governments. So he's like, the colonists are openly defying you. Nevertheless, he's like, they do like you and they think that you're a very good friend. They're loyal to you, but they're not going to obey these laws. So, and notice this is 1676. So 100 years before we get to the American Revolution, and also right in the middle of those two navigation acts I showed you. So this kind of lets you see the colonists didn't care for the laws, they ignored them, but the British Crown didn't necessarily care all that much. They had a policy of salutary neglect. Finally, Britain will change course. A few things that you'll want to look into that I'm not going to talk about. The Molasses Act of 1733 begins to change this idea a little bit. And then, of course, the big one is the French and Indian War, which is right at the end of our time period. The end of salutary neglect and the increased enforcement of mercantilist policies will change the relationship between Great Britain and her colonies on the eve of the American Revolution. This might be a no-brainer, but when we get to things like in the 1760s, the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties, and some of those famous taxes that lead up to the American War for Independence, that's really the end of salutary neglect and the breakdown of these mercantilist economic policies. All right, that's it for now. Thank you.